All right, let's talk about mail-in voting. So, if you've been keeping up with this upcoming election cycle, you know that there's a big debate going on right now between essentially, it seems like Trump and pretty much all the Democrats over whether or not we should have this widespread mail in voting during the coronavirus pandemic. And there's lots of different arguments flying around, and it's kind of hard to keep track of. So essentially, though, a lot of the arguments from Trump claim that, if we have this widespread mail in voting, there's going to be a bigger influx of voter fraud, and this election is going to be, completely useless because we're not going to know who really won because there was so much fraud. Then, on the Democratic side, you have them saying that we have to switch to mail-in voting because the pandemic is so dangerous. We need to, stay inside and vote by mail. It's completely safe. We're all good. Now, both of the things that each of these parties is saying isn't entirely the whole story, and there's a lot more to what's going on with mail-in voting. So I wanted to kind of walk through it so we could piece together what the groups have right and what they have wrong and all that jazz. So let's take a look. We start here on this argument that the truth about mail-in voting is that it's fair, safe, and honest. And they talk about a few things there, but getting down to their points here. First, they address voter fraud. They say voter fraud is rare overall and rarer by mail. When voter fraud does occur, election administrators identify it and take action, correcting election returns and prosecuting those responsible. That's what happened in North Carolina in 2018 when Republican political activists paid others to collect incomplete absentee ballots so they could be filled out to vote the Republican candidate. The activist was arrested, charged, and convicted, and the entire election was invalidated and ran again. But overall, election fraud is rare, according to them. A database of election fraud reports maintained by the Heritage Foundation reports approximately 1,200 allegations of voter fraud, for which there were 1,100 criminal convictions of voter fraud since 2000. Of those, only 204 allegations and 143 convictions involved mail-in ballots. That is a tiny fraction of the roughly 250 mail-in ballots cast over the 2 decades. In addition, problems are extremely rare in states that rely primarily on vote by mail. Of course, any voting system must be protected against fraud. Election officials are already doing that, including prosecuting fraud attempts. Okay, so the point they're making here is that this type of fraud with the mail-in votes, the absentee votes, is so rare that it's not even really a problem because we can identify it and take care of it. And it's such a small fraction of all the votes. Well, there's a lot of things not being taken into consideration there. First, they're referring to this database right here on the Heritage Foundation. I'll put a link to this so you can actually go check it out and read the cases yourself. You can expand each case here and see what the conviction was. But you can narrow it down over here by state. I just chose all the states, and the type of fraud is fraudulent use of absentee ballots, so specifically the ones they're sending in by mail. And with these ballots, what they're saying is true with regards to like the number of convictions and the people that got in trouble for this. But one thing they're not taking into account is that with the numbers is that when someone commits fraud by mail or with an absentee ballot, and you can go through these cases here, there's many of them where it was just, a person maybe voting in person and absentee. So it was like 2 votes as opposed to their normal 1. But there's a lot of cases here where the fraud was the person was sending in multiple ballots, sometimes 5, 10, 15, 20, 30. And that is a big discrepancy right there. So while that is one person committing this fraud, it is 30 votes that are being added in. So it's like it's a bigger difference, if that makes sense. So it's not just one person getting 2 votes in every single one of these cases. Sometimes it's many, many, many more votes that wouldn't have happened. So you have to take that into account with the fraud. Again, with the amount of people that did it, it's still not a massive, large number, but it is more than being, emphasized here. It is somewhat of a problem. Now, another thing you have to keep in mind with this fraud during mail-in ballots is you also have to remember that a lot of places aren't largely doing only mail-in ballots. It is It is more of a rare occurrence. Yes, some places do it more than others, but it is not widespread, full-fledged across the country. Everyone's voting by mail. So you also have to take into account the stress that is placed on the post office and the stress that is placed on any of these groups that are, getting these votes together, tallying the votes, and the collection of the votes, and the amount of people that are going to be, if everyone is expected to be voting by mail, all these factors add up and increase the chances for fraud. Not saying it will happen, but you have to keep in mind that there's that chance. So all that to say that the fraud argument, I think, holds a little more weight than a lot of the left and Democrats are giving it. There is a high potential for fraud, and they say it's not a big deal at all, and that there's even more fraud in person, which I haven't found anywhere to back that up. But then again, against maybe what Trump's saying with, being completely opposed to mail-in voting because he thinks the entire, election is going to be thrown because of fraud, especially with his election. I think the fraud actually would play more of a role in some of the smaller elections where it's decided by like a few votes. And we've actually, if you go to the Heritage Foundation here and click some of these cases, there were actually some cases where the votes, could have changed the outcome of the election, or did change the outcome of the election because the person won by just a few, but the number of fraudulent votes was more than the person won by. So I think that is where a lot of the fraud will cause issues. I don't think it would necessarily maybe cause as many with regards to Trump's election, but you never know. Like I said, the chances could increase. But there's more to it than just whether or not it's going to be full of fraud or it's completely safe, not full of fraud. I think there's a little bit, maybe not as much as Trump's, emphasizing there. But there's other problems, and I think those are also what need to be addressed. So what else do they say about it? They say there's no partisan advantage, and that may or may not be true. I've heard each side say that it benefits the other side. The public can learn to trust mail-in voting, saying we can get used to it. They say, here we go. Mail-in voting is safe, reliable, and trustworthy. All this evidence leads to some clear conclusions. Voting by mail is, or with training of election officials and the use of common standards, can be made just as honest as in-person voting. Officials can help ensure public confidence by being transparent, communicating their plans and preparations. People are more interested in voting by mail than ever before. Okay, they go on to talk about COVID and whatever. So I think they say if the proper changes are made and, they set up the proper channels and the right rules and do everything the right way, mail-in voting will be safe, reliable, and trustworthy. Well, of course it would. Here's the problem. We are coming up on an election. I mean, all the elections are going on like this year. This is happening right now. And it's the same time that this pandemic hit with the virus and everything. So you're trying to switch it all at the last second. Now, doing anything on this large of a scale at the absolute last second probably isn't going to produce very good results, and you're probably not going to create a safe, reliable, and trustworthy system because you're scrambling at the last minute to change an entire system of the way we've done things. So I want to cover then other issues apart from fraud that we've had with some of the elections, this year with some of the mail-in votes and absentee ballots. So let's get into some of those. So we have here why 10,000 absentee ballots were rejected in the Michigan primary. Michigan Secretary of State says more than 10,000 absentee ballots were rejected. While the large majority of ballots were approved and counted, the state says approximately 10,600 were rejected. More than 8,600 were due to signature verification issues or late arrival. Other reasons include wrong address, wrong signature, empty envelope, or unconfirmed. The data demonstrates that thousands of people who cast otherwise valid votes were not able to sign and participate in last week's election solely because the legislature failed to act ahead of the primary. With the turnout and the absentee ballot numbers expected to double or even triple in November, We could be looking at tens of thousands of Michigan citizens disenfranchised if the legislature again fails to act. Benson has been pushing for changes, calling for passing bills to allow ballots to be counted earlier and to be valid if postmarked by Election Day. Currently in Michigan, absent voter ballots are not allowed to be opened until the morning of Election Day, though they can be cast up to 35 days prior to Election Day. So it goes on to talk about the numbers of voters they have there and whatnot. But again, 10,000 ballots rejected in that case. 1 in 5 mail-in ballots rejected in botched New York City primary. More than 1 in 5 mail-in ballots were rejected in New York City during the state primary June 23rd. City election officials rejected 84,000 ballots, 21% of all those received by election officials. More than 403,000 ballots were returned to the election officials, but only about 319,000 were counted, the certified results showed. Let's move on to California. California rejected 100,000 mail-in ballots because of mistakes. More than 100,000 mail-in ballots were rejected by California election officials during the March presidential primary, according to the data obtained by the Associated Press, highlights a glaring gap in the state's efforts to ensure every vote is counted. So it's tallying up here, folks. It's tallying up. This is a report by NPR, which I kind of have to take with a grain of salt now with some of the stuff that's come out lately from them with them editing things. But thousands of mail-in ballots rejected for tardiness. Mail-in voting, which tens of millions of Americans are expected to use this November, is fraught with potential problems. Hundreds of thousands of ballots go uncounted each year because people make mistakes, such as forgetting to sign the form or sending it in too late. An NPR analysis has found that in the primary elections held so far this year, at least 65,000 absentee or mail-in ballots have been rejected because they arrived past the deadline. While the numbers are relatively small, around 1% in most states, they could prove crucial in close elections, like I was talking about before. This here is a chart of some states saw high mail-in ballot rejection rates. They are the mail-in ballot rejection rates for the 2020 presidential primaries. Gosh. For states with election day deadlines. So, different percentages for different states here, rejected for arriving late. Then way back, I think it was in April, Wisconsin had a big election issue. They had thousands of ballots. I'm going to post a video. I actually did a video on a lot of the problems we had when this was first starting. I will put a card up here at the top for you to click on, and because I don't really want to rehash all those election problems again, but just to cover, they had issues with Wisconsin. There was another one in that same video I cover with Pennsylvania's mail-in ballot problem where they had sent the wrong cards to the wrong voters and switched it to the wrong party. So we have issues with that, and it's just insane how many ballots are not going through, and everyone's talking about how these states are failing to get the absentee ballots out. But I'm seeing different responses to this problem of poor handling of these mail-in ballots. So the response from, some people is that this is clear evidence that we are not ready to transition into a full mail-in voting system right now. There are too many issues. We have potential fraud could increase, everything to do with fraud. You have the issues of ballots arriving late, not being able to be counted in time. You have the issues of improper deliveries, ballots being delivered to the wrong persons, or wrong people, the ballots not being delivered at all, the ballots being the envelopes arriving but they're empty, 2 ballots going to one person, no ballots going to another person. And then you have issues of negligence of that can come from people working at the post office, that can come many different workers in different positions that can come from. You have ballots just going missing, people apparently misplacing them, not getting votes in. So there's a lot of issues, and I see the one side saying, okay, this is too many issues to all deal with right now in August of 2020 with everything having to be decided here in the next few months. And then there's the other side saying, well, we just have to correct these problems and fix all these problems so mail-in ballots, work perfectly, so we don't risk dying from COVID when we go into the, voting locations. So with regards to these arguments, I think one holds more weight than the other. I would tend to believe that it's a really bad idea to switch to having almost everyone in the country vote by mail, because when you combine all those factors, it's going to be a very messy election. And even if you could come out and say that somebody won in the end, do you know how many people are not going to buy that and not believe that and it's already going to be bad as it is, especially if it does end up coming down to Trump and Biden, because there's so many people that are extreme on this issue and very emotional about it. I personally am a little excited for this Unity 2020 initiative coming out with a potential third candidate, which I have a video on that. I will link in the description you can look at. But if you're just looking at if Trump or Biden happens to win and we have gone through with this mail-in voting, and there are all these discrepancies with regards to fraud, missing votes and all that stuff, you are going to have a lot of people maybe even say they don't accept this election. A lot of people, if people are getting violent right now, I can only see it getting worse if their person doesn't win and they think it's due to some, either mistake or nefarious action on somebody's part. So that is why I don't really think that mail-in voting is a good idea. Again, in some circumstances, it's necessary, and people that are used to it are probably okay with it. And if it's in, acceptable doses, the postal system can handle it. But if the entire country goes to do it and they're overwhelmed with what they've had so far, it's only going to get worse, and they're going to get more overwhelmed. And if it's that big of a deal to people, more people will probably try to commit fraud and take advantage. So it just seems like a very scary idea. And I am not opposed to the idea of switching to mail-in voting at all, like widespread even, for the future. But trying to implement it all within the span of a few months here seems like a terrible idea. If you could get together and come up with a good plan, and you showed me all the safety precautions you could take, and there was, you started to, dole it out slowly over the next couple of years here, and we tested it, and it was proving to work very well with larger and larger numbers of people, by all means, go for it, do it. And in the future, if something else bad happens where we really couldn't go in to vote in person, then hey, we're set up. Maybe consider that. Plan ahead for the future. But right now, trying to implement this and saying that, and people are going to have different opinions on whether or not they should be going out in public with regards to COVID, and that's probably the topic for another video. We're torn on that as well. We can see that the death rate is very low for it, so your chances of dying are relatively low compared to other risks you take in your everyday life. But then you also have to consider, well, what if I get COVID, survive it? What problems could come up then? Am I more likely to have, a good quality of life for the rest of my life? Is it going to mess up, am I going to have health problems for the rest of my life because I had COVID? So you have to there's not an easy answer. There's risk involved either way. So you could take a bunch of safety precautions. My opinion would be that the best option is to set up in-person voting centers, let people go vote, but do it with these safety precautions that you have all these other places do. I mean, clean things, disinfect things, but what are the rules now? We got to keep apart. We have to wear masks. Whatever the rules may be, whatever the best option to really minimize the risk, do that. That doesn't mean you absolutely have to stay at home. And especially, too, it's kind of sad when these arguments are being made by people to stay home that have encouraged people to go out in the streets and do all manner of hanging out together to, argue a cause. You could make the argument that they can all band together at home and make YouTube videos and protest that way, or whatever it may be. But this idea that it just seems like each group is trying to, find a way that is going to help them win or maybe make them come out on top. So you have to look at all those things when looking at the way we're going to handle these elections. So overall, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to bring up that it's not as cut and dry as it may seem with, if you get your news from one place, Trump looks like an idiot saying that there's going to be voter fraud. And if you get your news only from Trump's side and the other side, you probably think that everybody's going to be committing fraud through mail-in ballots. So, like I said, there's a lot of stuff in the middle there that needs to be covered and addressed. But overall, I don't think it's the best idea for us to switch to mail-in voting on a large scale. So that pretty much does it for this segment. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will post you some links to some of the statistics on the absentee mail-in voting. If you got nothing else to do and you just feel like looking at statistics, that's fine. Other than that, if you would leave a like or subscribe, it helps with the algorithm and you'll be notified when we come out with new videos on stuff like this. And that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you guys for watching, and you all have a good one.